Hello and welcome to Hare and the Hawthorn. My name's Kate Ray and I'm one of your two hosts. As usual, I've got the lovely Neil Rushton with me and we have a guest, and I knew I didn't want to say this from over the pond because it's one of those phrases that I don't particularly like at all, but way over from America, which is an absolute pleasure. I'm going to hand you over to do a quick intro from Neil first, and they'll be talking to Joshua.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. We have the great Joshua Cutchin with us today. And many of the viewers will know who Joshua is. He's a well-published author, and I'm just to give you because those who are not familiar with him may be very, very interested in the subject matters that he's written about. So just quickly, some of the books that he has written: A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. Fantastic title, that one. Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. That's 2 volumes with co-authored with Timothy Renner. And then 2 books which we're going to talk about mostly today. Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions, which I think that was 2018, and the most recent book, which we really want to go into in some detail today, is called Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of the paranormal. So that's where Joshua comes from. But maybe, Josh, you want to just give us a very brief outline of who you are, where you come from, and how you got interested in researching and writing about this material.
Well, first of all, I've been looking forward to this meeting for so long because we've been in each other's orbit for so long. So this has been it's going to be an absolute pleasure. The basic the thinnest of sketches is that I was sort of a monster kid growing up, and I always was gravitating towards these sort of stories of the unknown. But it wasn't until I started a day job with an hour-long commute and I got hooked into paranormal podcasts that interest really got rekindled. And I noticed some aspects of this sort of fairy food taboo that were cropping up in indigenous North American mythology surrounding Bigfoot and some other stuff. And I said, that's a really strange, very specific motif to crop up, and it's obviously not tied to the Persephone myth, as a lot of folklorists might tell you, because it's separated by an ocean, other side of the pond, as it were. So I sort of said, well, maybe someone should write a book about it. And then I realized that someone, I guess, was me. And then, once this bug bites you, I guess you live with the sting. You sort of get besmirched by being interested in these topics. So I just ran with it, I guess. And now here, something like 7 years later, I guess, I just released Ecology of Souls, which is kind of my snapshot on the way that, as we were chatting about before we started, it's a way that I make these phenomena work together for my own purposes. And if somebody else finds it resonates with them, then all the better.
That's brilliant. And we're going to talk about Ecology of Souls in a moment. But first, I think this is how I came across you first, your Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions. 2018, that is, isn't it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that I soon realized, this guy's on my wavelength. He's talking my sort of language. And what I was very impressed, I've seen and I've tried to write about this subject myself in terms of the fairy changeling phenomenon, which of course is a large part of this book. And I think it's one of the most difficult motifs in folklore to get under the skin of. There's something a bit different about changing phenomenon than everything else you see. So what do you think about that, and how that correlates with the fairies?
Well, it's difficult for a number of reasons. I mean, it intersects with so much child abuse that has nothing to do with the supernatural, for one. But I was kind of writing this about the time that my wife and I started trying to have kids. So there was that element as well too, because it's the idea, it's almost comforting to not think that the supernatural doesn't exist, because the idea of something like that with that sort of omnipotence preying upon the most vulnerable sector of our population is just kind of skeeved me out, if that if that term makes any sense for y'all. So that's another aspect to it as well. But like so much fairy folklore, there's so much kind of pop culture, you know, fantasy stuff that's sort of surrounding it, that sometimes it's hard to separate those two different things. So part of the reason that I embarked on it is I kind of wanted to lean into things that make me uncomfortable. That's kind of a guiding ethos that I have, is to sort of lean into things that make me uncomfortable. But also, I realized that there really wasn't sort of a one-stop shop for a lot of this changeling folklore. And also, to carry that comparativism further between the sort of modern expression of the UFO phenomenon and the older fairy folklore. That's just, Jacques Vallée brought a lot of those points up in 1969's Passport to Magonia, but he came away with some gold nuggets, but there's an entire ore, a vein of ore there that you can just continue to mine from. And I used to sort of hedge my bets and say, well, it looks like these things are very similar, but now I'm at the point where I'm like, I don't know which version is more correct, UFOs or fairies, whatever. I don't want to put a name on it, but I'm convinced at this point that it's describing the same phenomenon. Absolutely. So that was sort of another impetus for it. Yeah.
That book in particular really hit the nail on the head for me for a lot of things. And it was one of about 3 books that I read in succession, that I just thought, there is people out there who have the same kind of connections and thought patterns, and it was just so nice to kind of get things consolidated. I just want to ask you on a side note, when you started writing about these things, so you've gone from listening to podcasts and having a real interest, did you find that anything shifted or changed or became, did you have any strange encounters or any strange things that went off when you started writing about these subjects?
There's actually, this is kind of an interesting sort of segue. There is that passage in the Bible about the end of times coming like a thief in the night, right? And so like as a child, I would always like expect the end of the world to happen the next day, so that way I would forestall the end of the world, kind of like the Finn McCool thing, right? Somebody's got to say his name every day. So I've found that whenever I anticipate or expect something strange to happen, it just doesn't. And it's always when I'm not expecting it that it does, So in the wake of this, not really. You've always heard those things like the sort of John Keel effect, where the closer you look at these things, the closer they look back. But, I would say in the past 2 years, I've had some miraculous things happen to me. But they've been more along the lines of synchronicities and maybe a light poltergeist infestation here in the house.
Wow.
But again, completely out of left field in both those occasions. They make more sense in retrospect, but I wasn't expecting it at the time. So regarding specifically the writing of thieves, nope, nothing. I mean, sometimes I think that I'm supernatural kryptonite or psychically dead as a doornail or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's no, same here. Yeah. No, as psychic as a plank of wood. That's what I used to say about myself. So,
yeah.
Well, you've already touched there on something that's very important. The homogeneity of fairy traditions, cryptids, ghosts, even in your new book, and we'll get to this, near-death experiences, and of course aliens. And that's what I really enjoyed about Thieves in the Night. And also, well, let's get on to the new book, Ecology of Souls. Let me just make sure I've got the complete correct title, because I think viewers are going to love this one. Very reasonably priced on Kindle, I have to say, and it's a real 2-volume doorstep that you can really get your teeth into. But I just want to I want to give you a couple of quotes from the book that really stood out for me and encapsulated what you brought to the table with this book. And you're quoting other writers here. First one is Christopher Knowles, who I'm quite familiar with, and he has the beautiful quote which you put into the book, and it is, the paranormal to me is essentially phenomena that wells up around death and either anticipates death or is some sort of running commentary during or after death. When paranormal things happen, it's almost always connected to death. And well, you can talk about expand on that in a moment. But the other quote that I loved Sorry, you're not quoting someone else. You're talking about J. Allen Hynek's term high strangeness, and you say theatre and symbolism are paranormal lingua franca, using J. Allen Hynek's term high strangeness to describe the often absurd nature of paranormal encounters and experiences. So, with that in mind, talk about the new book and what you were trying to do with it.
Well, so I want to clarify this first statement by saying that I am immeasurably indebted to the work of Jacques Vallée, and I think that he's moved the field of ufology forward in some pretty immeasurable ways. But as we were talking about him sort of leaving some things on the table, I think that this is kind of the thing that lingers in the back of Passport to Magonia and sort of haunts that work in a lot of ways, because okay, well, the UFO thing looks a lot like the fairy thing, but how did those people tend to think of the good folk? What would a passport to Magonia written in 1300 look like? And it probably would have said, hey, these things look a lot like the dead. And pre-theosophy, that was one of the primary ways that the good folk were talked about. Not to say exclusively, but there was always this connection. You find this time and again of dead neighbors being in fairyland, or the dead becoming fairies, or it's kind of nebulous, but there's definitely always been a connection there. So there was that, and then you couple that with one of the observations that Whitley Strieber's wife Anne made in the wake of his release of communion. They were getting tens of thousands of different letters from experiencers, and one of the things that she presciently noted was this has something to do with what we call death. And then on top of that, one of the things that I always go to whenever I'm, sort of talking to somebody about why I don't really like the extraterrestrial hypothesis that much is the fact that people do see dead loved ones and dead friends during their experiences or during a period when they have a lot of UFO activity. So I really wanted to unpack this. And I thought maybe I could get it done in like 80,000 words. And now, 260,000 words later, I wound up with this because I found that, like, as you wanted to talk about the UFO thing, well, I've got to talk about, to really do this topic justice, you sort of got to go back and talk about these older concepts of the soul that we just don't talk about anymore. You've got to talk about polypsychism. You've got to talk about the idea that spirits travel in straight lines. And like, if you want to really present a holistic look at it, you almost have to sort of do, I mean, it's not a remedial first volume, but it kind of has that flavor if you're really involved in these topics. And just to say that, like, look, the scholarship has illustrated, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there's some sort of connection to shamanic initiation and UFO abductions. That's the work that Eddie Bullard did, or that the UFO thing looks like near-death experiences. That's what Kenneth Ring did. But again, I don't think anybody has really brought it together and say, okay, well, what if these are all sort of the same thing? It's all about crossing that threshold into the other world, and the people with the technology fetish can say dimensions all they want to. We might as well just call it another world, right?
Yeah.
Because functionally it's indistinguishable. So that was the main thrust of this for me. And so the title's a little bit misleading. A new mythology of death and the paranormal. The thing to lean on is the ecology of souls, because it really does seem to be somehow tied up in the way that we transition and come back, and just the very nature of ourselves and what might be within us that's also helping to make these phenomena manifest.
So do you think that just on a very basic level, it's to do with the perceiver of these experiences, then to how they receive, whether they have a fey experience or an alien abduction or a visitation from a loved one?
Well, I suspect that everything is so unified in that sort of monist sense that these distinctions are probably not really as clear as we've decided to make them. But you also look at a lot of the ways that these different experiences seem so personalized and tailor made towards people. I mean, synchronicities are probably the best example of that. But you'll find people meeting beings who know people better than they know themselves. So there is an aspect of this where you have to go, well, how much of this is self-generated? Not to say that it's all in your head or anything, but like, how much of this are we somehow projecting out, and it's combining with these other phenomena? And again, I suspect that the true answer is that, as so many of the UFO occupants have told witnesses, we are one with the one who is all. It is the me within thee. Like, this really unifying message of there being no true distinctions between anything, really. I think that's probably at the root of it all. But at the same time, there does seem to be an objective quality to this stuff, which is why you sort of end up employing sort of very Patrick Harper-esque terms like imaginal and, as opposed to imaginary and things like that.
Mm. I mean, do you think that those beings are actual, not physical beings, but energetic beings, and they present in a way that possibly that we can understand them in a context of what they're trying to teach us, or what their interactions is? I mean, I know people have incredibly frightening experiences, though, don't they, with other beings, whether it be aliens. I'm a paranormal investigator, so I kind of come from the ghost perspective as well as the fairy perspective, and it is, for me, trying to unpick whether it is just a way of people understanding a phenomena that their brain can't compute, or whether these things actually do occur in the way that they perceive them to occur.
I mean, I'm kind of inclined to say all of the above, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so I mean, I think that we're working with faulty basic first principles logic. I mean, the thing that you'll often run into is people say, well, how could the UFO be a psychic object and a physical object? And when it's like, well, number one, read your Jung, but number two, if you have a knowledge of, like, the earliest years of parapsychology, it was all about studying how ghosts interacted with the physical environment. I think we would all agree that ghosts are not physical in the sense that we've agreed, but one of the earliest ghost hunting methods, as I'm sure was spreading talcum powder on the floor and waiting for footprints, right? So, like, you have the non-physical interacting with the physical, which once you sort of realize that that's a false dichotomy, I think it opens up a lot of these things to different possibilities. I would say that I think there is some aspect of ourselves that sort of co-creates the experience. I think a lot of it's cultural conditioning. I think there's a reason that people don't see fairies as often, especially not in America, as they see UFOs and things like that. And I think that might be people are culturally primed to see certain things and to sort of hold other things as being a little bit silly. And, I think these ideas are wax and wane over time across different cultures. I don't know if that quite answered your question, but
no, I don't think anybody could answer the question. It's just, I think it's just one of those ones that will unfold and unfold. It's just a curious thing that kind of repeats in my brain. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, we haven't actually had anybody on here, and I know I'm diverting, Neil, I do apologise. We haven't had anybody come in to talk to us about their understanding of the links with the Sasquatch, because obviously in the UK we don't have sort of tall, shaggy men wandering around in the wilderness. We haven't got that much wilderness for a start, other than Neil. You might see him on a Saturday night stumbling back from a pub somewhere. But yeah, so what it fascinates me, this connection. And one of the things that I kind of mulled over, and it was bizarre at the same time as a lot of people were mulling over, and I'd had the conversation about, is the Sasquatch fairy? Is the Sasquatch in that realm, and obviously not knowing much about the the anything really around the Sasquatch. So talk to us about how sort of the Yeti Sasquatchy type characters fit into the model.
Well, you used to have a lot of wild men back in the day over there. And just stories from older text and whatnot. And you do run into every now and then, like, sightings of something that approximates Bigfoot in Ireland and the British Isles. But it does seem to be more. I think it's just y'all don't have enough room over there. So in America we're confronted with these gigantic swaths of land that just seem. I mean, honestly, even if you take in the indigenous perspective into account, people have probably barely been to some of these places that are supremely inaccessible. So I think that's part of it. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's about spaces being created for this sort of wild man archetype to well up. Is it sort of a fairy thing? I mean, you can draw a lot of different comparisons. Over here, there are Sasquatch researchers who will tell you, stone-faced, that a Bigfoot sneak into stables and braid horses' manes at night. And it's like, okay, well, that was something that if you transplant that exact same activity to 17th century Dorset, you're going to get a different explanation for it. And there are other sort of stories. I mean, if you take a look at some of the brownie stories that you find out of Scotland, it's almost always short and shaggy, but simian, right? And we do have stories of Littlefoot over here as well. So I think it's sort of helpful to look at them on this sort of fairy spectrum. But I feel like these terms are so sort of, I don't know how entirely useful they are, because I think that it's even the whole fairy thing is just sort of an attempt to describe whatever these things are. But yeah, I mean, there are other things that you find, like, there's this sort of subterranean
Yes.
connection with Bigfoot, where sometimes Bigfoot supposedly lives in caves, and like, okay, well, that's fairyland. Something that Tim Renner pointed out to me, which he's had a couple of these where he points something out to me and I go, there's nothing to it, Tim, I don't know why you're barking up this tree. And I'm like, oh no, there is an association with Bigfoot stories and buried treasure, which again, very, very much a fairy motif. But he noticed it and I kind of noticed it, and then as luck would have it, this past April, my in-laws moved into a portion of Florida. And if you look at this particular area in Florida, it's like after the Everglades, it's kind of like ground zero for Bigfoot sightings in Florida, skunk ape sightings, as it were. And I was talking with my mother-in-law about this, and she said, yeah, she says that's really interesting. She says, growing up around here, because she sort of they returned to where she had grown up. She said, growing up around here, we didn't get a lot of Bigfoot stories, but we got a lot of stories about pirates and buried treasure along the banks of the river. And I'm like, well, okay, yep, that tracks. So yeah, I mean, and I don't know how much of that is the phenomena objectively behaving in this way, or how much of that is us just assigning the same suite of characteristics to whatever our boogeyman du jour is, but there definitely seems to be some links there. And to say nothing of the way that the wadwos and the woodwos are kind of lumped into that fairy category as well, and that's pretty much as close to Bigfoot as you can get. And then there's a whole nother rabbit hole with the Green Man being an expression of Dionysus, and how that was sort of tied with satyrs and fauns, which even folklorists who are not into these topics will say satyrs and fauns were wild men, and so that automatically gives you sort of a gateway into the Bigfoot thing as well. So it's all mixed up. Like, I kind of would like to do like a branching tree of all these different things, because you talk about Bigfoot and wild men, and you're talking about Odin and satyrs and fauns and Santa Claus even. It's all these different things are sort of tied up in one another.
How do you get received within the general populace when you have discussions around the fae and around fairies? And I know from my experience, and I've said this many times before, I say, yeah, I believe in ghosts. People don't bat an eyelid. I say, yeah, I totally believe in aliens, and I get oh, okay. And then, you say, I believe in fairies, and they're like, right, you've lost the plot. You have seriously lost the plot.
That really does seem to be the bridge too far for a lot of folks. Actually, one of the least charitable responses that I got was in Galway. I was in a pub, and I mentioned it, and they just absolutely laughed at me. And I'm like, okay, well, I thought that well, we'd be cool here. But yeah, I think that's really tied to people's conception of what these things are, because no, I don't believe in that Disney thing. Like, I believe that I've heard from people that whatever is behind the fairy phenomenon can appear like that, because it can look however it damn well pleases. In fact, the editor of my book, Barbara Fisher, had been seeing lights in her backyard in Athens, Ohio, and she said that one night it approached her and it looked like a small a woman with wings, and she was very well versed in all the classic fairy lore, like Evans Wentz and Lady Wild and stuff like that, and she was shocked at that, and she got a voice in her head that said, we can look however we damn well please. So, but to that extent, like, I don't ascribe to that, which kind of, I hate to say it, kind of new age fairy belief. But as far as what this was describing, this body of folklore is describing, I think if you're interested in any of these paranormal topics, you sort of believe in the fairy faith by default, because it overlaps in so many ways and describes so many of the other things that we see.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about them appearing however they please is shown very well in something that you'll know very well, the Fairy Investigation Society's survey from a few years ago. And there's a vast range of fairy types in that survey, but quite a few of them come across as pretty archetypal, winged Victorian Tinkerbells, for want of a better word. And
much to my chagrin when using those stories, because I'm like, this is a great fairy story. Okay. I mean, people see what they see, right?
Exactly. And I have seen Simon Young's the most recent ones, which will be published whenever, this year or next year, in the new survey, and I've seen a few dozen of them, and that seems to have gone. Actually, the new ones tend to be much more more attuned with the proper sort of folkloric fairies.
And I would argue that is almost to be expected. I mean, I think you'd have to be, deaf and blind to not see that we are again in this magical renaissance. And there is an interest in taking these topics seriously in a way that there hasn't been before. And just as the UFO phenomenon sort of moved from steampunk airships to Art Deco flying saucers to deep state black triangles to now these stupid balls of plasma tic tacs. I think that the fairy phenomenon, if it is indeed behind this, just like the UFO phenomena, I think that it would make sense that it would sort of shift with the perceptions of the time. So there's been such a research in paganism and just magical practice in general that I think it completely tracks that we would start to see those older ideas fade away as people get more informed on what these things actually tended to look like a long time ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Why do you think? Sorry, why do you think that shift is occurring right now? That because there has been a raising, wanting to go back to more natural ways and to look at old religions and to sort of invite these energies into our spaces and into our lives. Why do you think that's shifting right now?
Well, I have a model in my head, which I'm sure any historian could come along and tear apart. But my basic model is that you have paganism, and then you have sort of a religion that comes in and tries to organize things and becomes too restrictive, and then you have atheism arise, and that was so popular in the last 20 years or so. I mean, it's dead on arrival now. Like the new atheist movement of the 90s is just nowhere to be found. But people respond to that atheism with the return to that sort of more earth-based worship, right?
Yeah.
They're sold this bill of goods that you're a meat robot and there's nothing after death, and they have a knee-jerk reaction to that, and then the cycle starts all over again. So I would think, and again, this is just my own model, I don't know if it holds up under scrutiny, but I think that it's this paganism, organized religion, atheism, paganism sort of cycle, and each one's a reaction to the other.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect segue to talk about one of my favorite subjects alongside fairies, and that is, of course, death, which is, of course, the recurring theme through Ecology of Souls, the new book, that you're tracing everything back to death. What does it mean? And it's very noticeable that you open up the book with a big chapter on the near-death experience. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, about why you decided to do that and how that links in as a paranormal type?
Well, first of all, I kind of felt guilty writing this because I'm writing about fairies and death. I'm like, this should be Neil writing this. Like, I felt that so many times. Like, I'm kind of stealing your shtick. But I did put you in there a couple of times. So
you did, yeah. No, thank you very much.
Yeah. But I suspect, and again, this is not a hard claim, but I suspect that there's an argument to be made that maybe the near-death experience is kind of like the most stripped down version of this, because there seem to be certain, unlike the way that these phenomena manifest in our lives, these things seem to be pretty fixed and constant regardless of belief system and societal influences. So with that, working under that principle, you can start to make a case, which it's stronger for some modalities than others, but you can start to make a case that, obviously the shamanic initiation experience in the states that those sort of indigenous cultures, the magical practitioners in those cultures, the state that they go into, it makes sense that will be a near-death state because so many of those initiations bring you to the point of death, either symbolically or literally. And then you say, well, those cultures sometimes use entheogens to replicate these experiences, and how many people have you talked to who've taken these substances and are convinced that they've died? And a lot of the hallmarks are there. If you dissect it apart, you see the lights and the tunnels and the dome spaces and the different types of entities that are reported are the same. These pastoral settings are the same. So you see all these things over and over again, and then from there, it's just a short leap to fairyland, and it's a short leap to the inside of a UFO. And the cryptids don't fit quite as well, because I suspect that it's less about going there and more about whatever that is coming here in the cryptid encounters. But you can still make some cases. I mean, for example, I was astonished to find how common amnesia is in Bigfoot encounters, for example, or even missing time in Bigfoot encounters. Like, it's something that happens more frequent. It's not a hallmark, but it happens more frequently than people realize. And those are two things that, might be the most constant thing across all these contact modalities, or time, compression or dilation, however you want to phrase it, and sort of amnesia of the experience if it's not recorded right away.
Yeah. It's well, you mentioned there, the taking of entheogens and how that can mimic the near-death experience in some ways. And I've only got your book Ecology of Souls on Kindle, so I can't show the cover, but the cover is great, because it's the late great Terence McKenna as a kind of Christ-like figure on the cover. It's a very distinctive cover, which gives you a good impression of what you're going to be talking about.
Well, and that's one of those Terence McKenna phrases. I'm not sure if he coined it, but he definitely popularized it, I think. And it's the idea that when you take DMT and you slip into this other space, perhaps the most conservative estimation is that you've slipped into an ecology of souls, as the shaman once said. So that's
a top impression of Terence.
Thank you, appreciate it. but yeah, and that's something that really always fascinated me too. Is like, as much as you want to get away from this death thing, Terence said that he turned a Tibetan Lama onto DMT. I don't know how that conversation unfolded, right? But he said he turned a Tibetan Lama onto DMT, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's as far as you can go without going past the point of no return." And Terence started calling it the bungee into the bardo. And if you look at that and you nest it within the sort of shamanic traditions, again, using a term very broadly there, but the shamanic traditions, and the fact that perhaps DMT plays a role at death, it just all starts to become quite parsimonious, which honestly kind of scares me, because I think it implies that I'm getting high on my own supply. It implies that I'm buying into my own ideas, which is always something that I've tried to avoid, but dang, it works really well for me. So
was it Terence McKenna? I've got a vague recollection. Sorry about.
Hold on, Kate. You've got to do a Terence McKenna impression now.
There's no chance, absolutely no chance. But was it Terence McKenna who gave a load of Tibetan monks DMT, and there was a vast proportion of them that were just totally weren't. It just didn't even do anything to them whatsoever.
It was LSD.
It was LSD.
Yeah. I don't know if I've heard that story, but it kind of tracks. I mean, it's, if you look at like alchemy and the ways of attaining the philosopher's stone, there was the dry way and the wet way, and the dry way was fast but perilous, and the wet way was slow and methodical but safe. And I think that that sort of dipole is the psychedelic experience or the meditative experience. So I can totally see a bunch of highly advanced meditation practitioners who are like, this is doing nothing for me. Like, this is a Tuesday.
Yeah, exactly. It's just their permanent state of being anyway.
Exactly.
Brings them back. Listen, as always, we are running out of time far too fast, and I think we've just started getting to the meat of matters. It just, honestly, I hate this. I really do. We've got literally about 4 minutes. If you could just run us down where people can find you, and also where people can find your literature. So and we'll put it all in the link underneath. But if you could run us down through that'd be great.
Absolutely. So I try to stay relatively up to date on everything with joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. All my news about appearances and things that are happening for me, as well as interviews like this one, are linked there. And if anybody is interested in copies of Ecology of Souls, in the continental United States at least, I can offer a discount. Basically, if you buy them together, there's a discount. If you buy them on Amazon, they don't allow you to do that. But if you buy them directly from me, I will sign them and you get a discount, because it's the same reason that I package the both volumes together in the ebook, is because it's more important to me to get these ideas out there than it is to make bokus of money on it. Yeah. So I mean, not that you make bokus of money on this stuff anyway, but you take my meaning.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Have you had good feedback on the book?
I've had very good feedback. I'm not sure if I can disclose where, although anybody who's familiar with what I do can probably discern, but this has been added to the required reading for some PhD programs in religion,
Wow.
which surprised the heck out of me, and
Wow.
I do not feel qualified for, but you know, I'm very humbled to report that. So the feedback from, you know, as expected, the feedback from, quite frankly, the thinkers, people who have a more academic and open-minded look at this, has been really good. The people who believe it's little green men coming to visit us, not so good. But you know, that's always to be expected when you're pushing against that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think anyone watching this podcast will just absolutely love the book, and will be you know, the way you are able to bring in new thinking, new angles, which, you know, I try to do myself, but the way you've done it with this book, and it's massively referenced as well. So if you can read the book, and then there's like 100 other books that you need to go and articles that you need to go and find because of all the references, which is not great for your wallet, but it's in terms of the research quality, it's absolutely top notch. So well done.
And it's
well, and
sorry, go on. Oh, I was just going to say. No, sorry.
You first.
Okay, I was just going to say, it sounds like the kind of book that would traverse the people who do watch this. So we have a good proportion of sort of ghost hunted, paranormal investigators, etc. And it's nice that this book will give people that oversight that I keep banging on about to people, you know, and sort of look at all these different segments and say, yeah, there is correlation between them. So
it's got something for everybody, and I don't want people to be put off or confused. There is a third book called the Ecology of Souls Companion, and that's just the reference material, but it's available for people who just have to have stuff in print, like myself. But it's also available on my website for free. So if you buy, so you don't have to pick up the third one just to see the references. If you bought 1 and 2, you've got the references there on my website. So
perfect. Well, I'm going to have to say thank you very much, because we are running out of time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and with all our guests, we're going to have you back. We are going to have you back at some stage and pick up and pick apart some of these things. I'm going to go away, buy the book, and sit down over the next few weeks, and I know I'm excited about it already.
Well, let me know when. Like, we just scratched the surface, and I think it's because we get along so swimmingly. So yes, I will be here. You just tell me when.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you, Neil. And we will be back pretty soon with a new podcast. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Joshua. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.